Imagine this. You've got a headache, maybe, or perhaps your child has a fever. You reach for that familiar bottle, the Tylenol, twist the cap, and you just trust it. Trust the medicine inside will help. It's such a simple, everyday thing, right?
Yeah.
But what if that trust was just shattered in
Yeah.
the most chilling way possible?
It's a scenario that became terrifyingly real back in 1982, right there in the Chicago area. What we're diving into today are the infamous Chicago Tylenol murders, a series of poisonings that, believe it or not, remain unsolved even now.
Right. And our mission here is to really unpack the sources, look at everything from the initial deaths, the frantic investigation,
Right.
all the way to the huge lasting changes it brought about. I mean, we're talking consumer safety, how companies react to crisis, and even, weirdly enough, Halloween traditions. So yeah, prepare yourself. There's some surprising facts here. We want to give you a real deep understanding of this pivotal moment.
Okay, let's get into it then. The horror started unfolding really fast, late September 1982. Can you walk us through those first terrifying hours, starting with the very first victim? Absolutely. It all began with Mary Kellerman. She was just 12 years old. On September 28th, she took an extra-strength Tylenol, ended up in the hospital, and tragically, she died the very next day, September 29th. But what really shocked everyone was how quickly other deaths followed, almost immediately.
And what was that progression? How did it escalate so fast?
Well, that same day, September 29th, it was just an explosion of tragedy. 6 more people died, all from contaminated Tylenol. You had Adam Janus, he was 27, his brother Stanley, 25, and Teresa Janus, only 19. All 3 of them died from pills taken from the same bottle. And then there were others. Mary McFarland, 31, Paula Prince, 35, and Mary Reiner, 27. It was just this incredibly rapid, horrifying chain of events.
Wow, so deaths happening that quickly across different locations.
Yeah.
How did investigators manage to connect these seemingly separate tragedies back to Tylenol so fast? Who first started putting the pieces together?
Yeah. It really speaks to some incredibly sharp detective work, almost intuition. There was a nurse, Helen Jensen, investigating the Janus deaths in Arlington Heights. She found the Tylenol bottle, noticed 6 pills were missing, and just had this gut feeling. She suspected a link and handed it straight over to investigator Nick Pichos.
Okay, and once Pichos had the bottle, how did they actually confirm it was poison, specifically cyanide?
Well, Pichos contacted Edmund Donahue, the deputy chief medical examiner for Cook County. Donahue had this amazing foresight. He suspected cyanide, possibly from the cluster of deaths. He actually asked Pichos to smell the bottle.
Smell it.
Yeah. And when Pichos reported sort of an almond-like scent, a classic sign of cyanide, they moved fast. The county's chief toxicologist, Michael Schaefer, tested the capsules right away, and the results were just horrifying. 4 of the remaining capsules in that one bottle had nearly 3 times the fatal dose of cyanide. That discovery immediately triggered a press conference warning the public, stop taking Tylenol. And that, just sparked widespread alarm.
I can only imagine. The alarm must have spread like wildfire. Initially, they linked the Janus and Kellerman bottles to the same manufacturing lot, right? MC 2880, which prompted Johnson & Johnson's first recall. But then it got even more complex.
It did. Because very quickly they found tainted bottles from other manufacturing lots, like Lot 1910 MD and MB 2738 from Mary McFarland's pills. This discovery meant the contamination wasn't isolated to just one batch, it was potentially much wider. And that's what forced the really massive expansion of the recall.
How big did that recall eventually get? It sounds unprecedented.
Oh, it was completely unprecedented. October 5th, 1982, a nationwide recall of all Tylenol products containing acetaminophen capsules. Every single one. We're talking an estimated 31 million bottles, valued at over 100 million US dollars back then.
Wow.
Yeah. Johnson & Johnson put out widespread warnings. They halted all production, stopped advertising. They even offered to exchange any capsules people had for solid tablets. And the impact went global. Customs agents at international airports started asking travelers if they were carrying Tylenol.
Given how widespread this seemed, the immediate question must have been, how? How is this even possible? Where did the police think the tampering actually happened?
They quickly developed a working theory that the tampering must have happened after the Tylenol was already on store shelves. See, the capsules themselves were made in 2 completely different places, Pennsylvania and Texas, so contamination at the factory seemed really unlikely. Instead, the police hypothesis was that someone, somehow, took bottles off the shelves from various stores in the Chicago area, Jewel Foods, Osco Drug, Walgreens, places like that, laced the capsules with cyanide, and then put the bottles back on the shelves, just waiting for someone to buy them.
That method,
Yeah.
It sounds like a nightmare for investigators, a completely new kind of challenge. What did that mean for finding evidence? And what sort of unusual tactics did they have to resort to?
It made the investigation incredibly difficult. I mean, there's no single crime scene, no clear starting point. The FBI even tried something pretty unconventional. They got a Chicago Tribune columnist, Bob Greene, to publish Mary Kellerman's home address and the location of her grave. With the family's permission, of course.
Why would they do that?
The theory was maybe the killer would feel compelled to visit one of those sites, sort of a morbid curiosity. So they put both locations under 24-hour surveillance for months. But nothing. The killer never showed up. Another tantalizing clue, or maybe a dead end, was a surveillance photo. It showed Paula Prince buying her Tylenol at a Walgreens. And right behind her, just feet away, was this unidentified man with a beard. Police thought he might be the killer, but they could never identify him.
So despite all these efforts, who actually emerged as the main suspects? Who did investigators focus on?
There were really two primary suspects who came under intense scrutiny, although, crucially, there was never definitive proof against either for the poisonings themselves. First, there was James W. Lewis. He was accused of sending an extortion letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding $1 million to stop the cyanide murders.
Right, the extortion letter. But what else made Lewis such a strong suspect?
Well, when they arrested him, he gave authorities this chillingly detailed description of how the attacks could have been carried out. You know, buying the Tylenol, adding the cyanide, putting it back on the shelves. Almost like a blueprint. Plus, they found a poisoning manual in his possession, and his fingerprints were actually on pages related to cyanide. Now, Lewis denied the poisonings themselves. He admitted, right in the letter, sure, but claimed it was this convoluted scheme to frame his wife's former boss. He was eventually convicted, but only for the extortion. He got 10 years in prison. There's also this really intriguing detail about the letter's postmark, October 1st, 1982. That suggests he might have started writing it before the news of the Tylenol connection really broke widely, a timeline he later backed away from when questioned. Yeah, and even as late as 2009, court documents showed that some DOJ investigators still believed Lewis was responsible, but they just didn't have enough hard evidence for murder charges. They collected his DNA and his wife's in 2010, but it didn't match any DNA found on the recovered bottles. Lewis maintained his innocence right up until his death in 2023.
Okay, quite a complex picture there. And who was the other main person of interest?
The other significant suspect was a man named Roger Arnold. He worked as a dock worker at a Jewel Osco warehouse. He came onto the radar because a bar owner reported him. Apparently, Arnold had been talking about killing people with a white powder and bragged about having potassium cyanide.
Okay, that sounds suspicious.
It gets more specific. Arnold actually had connections to one of the victims, Mary Reiner. He worked with her father, and Arnold's wife had been treated at a hospital near the store where Reiner bought her contaminated Tylenol. Circumstantial, but connections nonetheless.
And was there any physical evidence linking Arnold to cyanide or the methods?
Investigators found a copy of a book called The Poor Man's James Bond in Arnold's home. And that book apparently contained instructions on how to make potassium cyanide. Police brought him in for questioning multiple times, but ultimately he was never charged with Tylenol poisonings. There was a tragic postscript, though. In 1983, Arnold tracked down and killed John Stanisha.
Why?
He mistakenly thought Stanisha was the bar owner who had reported him to the police earlier. Arnold was convicted for that murder and served 15 years. His body was actually exhumed in 2010 for DNA testing as part of the renewed investigation efforts. But again, his DNA didn't match the samples they had from the Tylenol bottles.
So the investigation didn't just stop in the 80s. You mentioned renewed efforts much later. What prompted the FBI to take another look decades later?
Yeah, there was a significant push around 2009. The FBI's reasoning was basically twofold. First, the 25th anniversary of the murders brought the case back into the public eye, maybe shaking loose new information. And second, crucially, advances in forensic technology, especially DNA analysis, offered new hope. Maybe evidence that was useless back then could yield clues now.
Right.
So that's when they searched Lewis's home again. And in 2011, they even went so far as to request DNA samples from Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber.
Kaczynski, why him?
Mostly because of his connections to the Chicago area during that period, but Kaczynski denied ever possessing cyanide. Despite all these later efforts, though, the bottom line remains the same. No one has ever been charged or convicted for the actual Tylenol poisonings. It's still officially unsolved.
A truly baffling crime, then, and one that left this massive, unprecedented legacy.
Oh.
What were some of the most immediate kind of chilling consequences for the public after the Chicago deaths?
Oh, the most immediate and terrifying consequence was a wave of copycat incidents. It was almost instantaneous. Hundreds of them popped up across the U.S., people tampering with other medicines, food products, you name it. It wasn't just Tylenol anymore. This really tapped into a deep public fear, a sense of vulnerability about everyday products.
And these weren't just minor scares or hoaxes, right? There were more tragic deaths linked to tampering.
Absolutely. Tragically, yes. In 1986, a woman named Diane Ellsroth died in Yonkers, New York. Cyanide-laced Tylenol again. That same year, out in Washington state, two people, Susan Snow and Bruce Nichol, died from cyanide found in Excedrin capsules.
Excedrin, too.
Yes. And that case actually led to a conviction. Bruce Nichol's wife, Stella Nichol, was found guilty. She was convicted under the new federal anti-tampering laws that were passed specifically because of the Chicago incident. Also in '86, Procter & Gamble had to recall their pain reliever, Incaprin, just due to a spiking hoax. That shows you the level of paranoia.
And the list unfortunately kept going, didn't it?
It did. 1991, again in Washington state. Kathleen Danaker and Stanley McWhorter died from cyanide put in Sudafed capsules. Another woman, Jennifer Melling, survived a similar poisoning. Her husband, Joseph Melling, was later convicted for those crimes, trying to kill his wife, presumably for insurance money. And then there's the strange, sad case of Kenneth Ferries in Texas in 1986, died from cyanide in Anniston. Initially, it was ruled a homicide, like the others, but then investigators determined he likely obtained the cyanide himself from a lab where he worked, and they reclassified it as a suicide. It just highlights how difficult it became to determine motive and separate real tampering from other scenarios in that climate of fear.
Okay, so beyond the copycats and the fear, Johnson & Johnson's response to the initial crisis, that became legendary in business circles, right? What exactly made their handling of it so groundbreaking?
It really did become the gold standard. I mean, the case study in crisis management. Instead of deflecting or downplaying, which many companies might have done, J&J went the opposite route. Full transparency. They immediately pulled 31 million bottles off the shelves, at enormous cost, as we said. And they worked incredibly closely and openly with the Chicago police, the FBI, the FDA. No defensiveness.
Right.
It was this proactive, trust-building approach, reportedly guided by PR executive Harold Burson. It basically demonstrated that a company could weather a disaster, even thrive afterwards, by putting public safety absolutely first above short-term profits. The Washington Post even praised them for avoiding a 3-mile island type of corporate meltdown scenario.
And did it work? How quickly did they actually manage to regain public trust and get back their market share after such a devastating blow?
Amazingly fast. Their market share for Tylenol plummeted, naturally. It went from about 35% down to maybe 8%. But within less than a year, they had bounced back. Not just recovered, but regained their position as the top-selling pain reliever.
Less than a year. That's incredible.
It really is. A huge part of that was reintroducing Tylenol, but this time in new triple-sealed, tamper-resistant packaging. They coupled that with heavy advertising and promotions to reassure consumers. There's also an interesting side note from an insurance dispute later on. It revealed J&J had actually chosen not to buy the more expensive type of recall insurance. A court later ruled their recall wasn't technically forced by liability for the deaths, but by the notice of potential harm, which suggests they took those massive, costly steps primarily because they felt it was the right thing to do for public safety. And eventually, in 1991, J&J settled all the lawsuits related to the original Chicago deaths. The amount was undisclosed. They stated they wanted to help the families finally move past the tragedy.
So this whole response, the crisis itself, it clearly revolutionized consumer safety across the board. What were the biggest, most lasting changes that we still see today because of the Tylenol murders?
Oh, the changes were sweeping and fundamental. This incident was the direct catalyst. It forced the entire pharmaceutical industry, but also food companies, consumer goods manufacturers, everyone, to develop and implement tamper-resistant packaging. Think about those foil seals under bottle caps, the plastic wraparound lids.
Yeah, you see them everywhere.
Exactly. Those became standard practice directly because of this. It wasn't just voluntary industry changes either. New federal anti-tampering laws were enacted, making product tampering a serious federal crime. And those laws were used, as we mentioned, to convict people like Stella Nichol.
And thinking about the products themselves, beyond just the packaging, were there other shifts?
Yes, definitely. The pharmaceutical industry largely moved away from the easily opened two-piece capsules, which were so vulnerable. They shifted towards solid tablets or developed the caplet, basically a tablet shaped like a capsule, much harder to tamper with non-destructively. And of course, just the general expectation now for almost any consumable product is some kind of tamper-evident seal. It's become totally ingrained in consumer expectation.
Okay, and here's one of the most maybe surprising and definitely unintended consequences that still kind of lingers. Halloween. The Tylenol crisis hit right in October 1982. How did that specific timing affect Halloween?
Yeah, the timing was uniquely terrible for Halloween traditions. It massively amplified existing, though largely unfounded, fears about people putting poison or razor blades in Halloween candy.
Right, the urban legends.
Exactly. Those stories existed before, but the Tylenol news made it feel suddenly, terrifyingly plausible to many people. Even though, it's important to stress, there are still no documented cases of strangers randomly poisoning trick-or-treat candy like that. But the fear was real in '82. Some communities actually discouraged or canceled trick-or-treating, and nationwide candy sales reportedly dropped by over 20% that year. That fear, unfortunately, became a much more prominent, albeit still statistically baseless, part of the Halloween narrative for a whole generation.
So wrapping this up, we've journeyed through the tragic Chicago Tylenol murders, a crime that remains unsolved, yet had these profound ripple effects. It fundamentally redefined product safety, corporate responsibility, and even, unexpectedly, shaped a public holiday.
It truly was a watershed moment, a really stark reminder of how fragile trust can be, especially in the things we consume every day. And maybe that leaves us with a final thought, something for you, our listener, to consider. In today's world, with information coming at us constantly and supply chains stretching all over the globe, what steps can you take to stay vigilant, to maintain a healthy skepticism about the products you use? And maybe, considering the enduring mystery of who did this, what does the Tylenol case tell us about the nature of justice or even closure when a perpetrator is never definitively brought to account for such a devastating act?